Stalin. I mean, the name itself just conjures these images of, well, immense power, doesn't it?
He really does.
But before he became the Man of Steel, there was Joseph Vissarionovich Chugashvili, born way back in 1878.
Mm.
So this deep dive, we're digging into a detailed historical overview, trying to understand the life and, maybe more importantly, the huge impact of this, well, undeniably pivotal figure of the 20th century.
And it's definitely a complex story. I mean, putting it mildly. Stalin's legacy is just this stark duality, you know?
How so?
Well, on one hand, you have the architect of a Soviet superpower, the victor over fascism, absolutely. But then you also have the embodiment of totalitarian rule, political terror, just widespread suffering.
Exactly. And for you listening, our goal here isn't just to, list facts. It's to pull out the essential insights, make it clear, engaging.
Right. Cut through the noise.
We want to get past the information overload and really highlight the surprising bits, the significant details that truly shed light on his, well, extraordinary and, yes, deeply controversial life. Okay, let's unpack this. Where does the journey of this Man of Steel actually begin?
It starts in Gori, Georgia, which at the time was part of the huge Russian Empire. It was a really vibrant place, culturally diverse. He was born Joseph Bessarionis Zhigashvili. They called him So-So when he was young. He was actually the only one of his parents' children to survive past infancy.
And it wasn't exactly a comfortable start in life for him, was it?
Not at all. His father, Bessarion, he was a shoemaker, right?
Yep.
But his business started failing, income dropped, and it plunged the family into real poverty. He also became an alcoholic and apparently was quite harsh towards his wife and young Yoseb. By the time Yoseb was about 5, he and his mother, Ekaterina Jaladze, had actually left the family home.
Really? So they were on their own?
Pretty much. They led this sort of nomadic life for the next decade or so. Ekaterina, his mother, she was really determined, though. Determined to get him an education, worked tirelessly to support him.
And we also see signs of physical hardship early on, too.
That's right. He had smallpox as a child, which left him with facial scars. And then, around age 12, there was a pretty significant accident involving a horse-drawn carriage, a phaeton, they called it.
Okay.
And that accident left his left arm permanently impaired. Shorter, less mobile. Interestingly, this actually played a role later, getting him exempted from military service.
Despite all that, he did well in school initially.
He did, yes. At the Gori religious school, he was actually quite bright. Showed a real flair for things like drawing, drama, even poetry and singing.
So hints of a more artistic side early on. But then his path took a pretty sharp turn when he went to the Tiflis Spiritual Seminary.
It really did. He started off well there, too. Good student. But his focus shifted dramatically. He got completely drawn into revolutionary ideas. So his grades started slipping, and he faced disciplinary action for, well, what they saw as rebellious behavior. He joined this forbidden reading club at the seminary.
Forbidden? What were they reading?
Things like Nikolai Chernyshev What Is to Be Done and Alexander Kazbagi's The Patricide. Actually, the main character in The Patricide, Koba, that's where he got his famous early pseudonym from.
Koba, right? This is where he really embraces Marxist ideas.
Exactly. Through all this reading, he encountered Karl Marx's Das Kapital, and he just wholeheartedly adopted Marxist sociopolitical theory. This ideology, promising an end to czarist oppression, social inequality. It was gaining a lot of traction in Georgia then.
Right. As a form of anti-czarist thought.
Precisely. So he started attending these secret workers' meetings, got introduced to Silabistro Silva Jabladze, who was a really key figure in Georgian Marxism, a founder of the Mesami Dasi, the third group. Ultimately, this growing revolutionary passion led him to just abandon his religious studies altogether. He left the seminary in April 1899, didn't even graduate.
Wow. From nearly becoming a priest to a dedicated revolutionary, that's quite a transformation. What were his first moves in this new life?
Well, in October 1899, he managed to get a job. He started working at the Tiflis Meteorological Observatory.
Really? An observatory?
Yeah, seems a bit random, right? But his real focus, his true commitment, was still on revolutionary activities. He started gathering followers, running socialist study groups, and he secretly organized a May Day workers' meeting in 1900, which actually sparked a strike.
Okay, so he's already organizing.
Definitely. And by this point, the Okhrana, that's the Tsar's secret police, they were watching him. They knew he was involved in the revolutionary underground in Tiflis. This kind of early experience with clandestine organizing, it really became a defining feature of his whole career.
So the authorities were onto him pretty early in his revolutionary days.
Oh, absolutely. They actually planned to arrest him in March 1901. But he got tipped off, managed to slip away, went underground, had to rely on relatives for support. While he was in hiding, though, he was still active. He helped plan this pretty major workers' demonstration for May 1st, 1901. About 3,000 people turned out, and there were clashes with the police.
Wow.
He got really good at using aliases, moving between safe houses, just constantly trying to evade capture. And then in November 1901, he got elected to the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDRP. That was the main umbrella group for Russian socialists.
But his activities soon spread beyond just Tiflis, didn't they?
Indeed. That same month, November 1901, right after being elected to the Tiflis Committee, he moved, went to the Black Sea port city of Batum.
Okay.
But his more radical approach caused some friction there. Some of the local Marxists were suspicious. Some even thought he might be a Tsarist agent provocateur.
Paranoia already setting in.
Yeah. He found work at the Rothschild refinery there, and he was key in organizing two big strikes. When the worker leaders got arrested, he kept pushing, agitated for more action. He actually incited this mass protest that tragically led to an attempted prison break.
Yeah.
Soldiers opened fire on the crowd. 13 people were killed.
A devastating outcome for that protest.
Absolutely horrific. Stalin then organized another demonstration, this time at their funeral, but that led to his own arrest in April 1902. He was imprisoned first in Batumi, then moved to Kutaisi, and finally, in mid-1903, he got sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. It's a pretty standard punishment for revolutionaries back then.
Siberia, that's a harsh sentence. What was it like for him there?
He arrived in this place called Novaya Uda in late November 1903. Conditions were basic, a peasant hut. He tried to escape twice.
Twice.
Yeah. The first time failed, he got frostbite. But the second attempt, in January 1904, that one worked. He made his way all the way back to Tiflis.
Wow. Resourceful.
Back in Tiflis, he teamed up with Philip Makaradze, and they started co-editing the Georgian Marxist newspaper, Proletariatus Brzola, which means the struggle of the proletariat.
And this period back in Tiflis wasn't smooth sailing within the party either, was it?
Yeah.
Conflicts arose.
That's right. He stirred things up quite a bit. He controversially argued that the Georgian Marxist movement should actually separate from the main Russian movement, become independent.
Oh, that wouldn't have gone down well.
Not at all. It sparked immediate accusations of nationalism from others in the RSDRP. They saw it as, betraying the whole internationalist ideal of Marxism. He faced threats of expulsion, and eventually he had to back down, retract his call. You have to remember, the RSDRP itself was getting really fractured around this time. The main split was between Lenin's more radical Bolshevik faction and Martov's more moderate Mensheviks.
Right, the famous split.
Exactly. And Stalin, finding himself clashing with many of the Mensheviks who were dominant in Georgia, started aligning himself more and more with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But even with a base he built up in this mining city, Kietura, the Bolsheviks were still very much a minority in Georgia compared to the Mensheviks.
So back in Tiflis, he's now firmly in the Bolshevik camp, even if they're the minority locally. What were the next big steps for him?
Well, November 1905 turned out to be pretty crucial. The Georgian Bolsheviks picked Stalin as their delegate for this important all-Bolshevik conference. It was meant to be in St. Petersburg, but got moved last minute to Tampere, which was in Finland then, part of the Russian Empire, but with some autonomy. When he arrived, it was actually Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, who told him about the change of location. And it was at this Tampere conference in 1905 that Stalin met Vladimir Lenin in person for the very first time.
Wow. The first meeting. That's a moment.
A huge moment. This face-to-face encounter between these two future leaders. It was pivotal, really, for both of them, and obviously for 20th century history.
A meeting that really would shape the course of history. What was their initial dynamic like? Did they click immediately?
Well, Stalin definitely held Lenin in very high regard, but their views didn't perfectly align right away. For instance, Stalin disagreed with Lenin's idea of participating in the upcoming elections for the State Duma, the Russian parliament.
Why is that?
Stalin basically thought engaging with the parliamentary system was pointless, a waste of time for revolutionaries. But despite that disagreement, by April 1906, Stalin attended the 4th Congress of the RSDRP in Stockholm. That was actually his first trip outside the Russian Empire.
And this Congress had implications for the kind of activities he'd get involved in next, right?
Absolutely. At that Congress, the Mensheviks were in the majority. And they passed this resolution specifically banning armed expropriations, basically, revolutionary robberies used to fund party activities.
Oh, the so-called X's?
Exactly. Lenin and Stalin both strongly opposed this ban, and they secretly met with other Bolsheviks to discuss, well, ignoring the resolution and continuing these kinds of actions anyway to get funds for the cause.
Secret plotting already.
Yes. And amidst all this, in July 1906, Stalin married Cato Svanidze. They had an Orthodox ceremony in Sanaki. And in March 1907, their son Yakov was born. By this point, as historian Robert Service points out, Stalin had really cemented his reputation as a leading Georgian Bolshevik.
But around this time, his involvement in these revolutionary activities takes a much more violent, darker turn.
Tragically, yes. He attended the 5th Congress of the RSDRP in London in May-June 1907. When he got back to Tiflis, Stalin orchestrated this incredibly brazen bank robbery in June 1907.
The Tiflis bank robbery.
Yes.
Infamous.
Extremely. His group ambushed an Imperial Bank stagecoach right in Erevansky Square using guns and homemade bombs. It was brutal. About 40 people were killed in the chaos.
40? Good grief.
Yeah, 40's dead. And incredibly, all of Stalin's group managed to escape. This act, this extreme violence, it really highlights the ruthless tactics some Bolsheviks were willing to employ.
A truly audacious and incredibly deadly act. What happened to Stalin immediately after that?
Well, after the robbery, he moved, relocated to Baku with his wife and infant son. The Mensheviks, understandably furious, confronted him about the heist and actually voted to expel him from the RSDRP.
Did that stick?
Stalin just ignored them, completely disregarded their decision. He focused on building Bolshevik power within the Baku branch of the RSDRP instead. He became editor for 2 Bolshevik newspapers there, Bakinsky Proletary and Gudak, which means the whistle. And showing his continued ambition, in August 1907, he even went to the 7th Congress of the Second International. That was a big socialist organization held in Stuttgart, Germany. So still active on the international stage, despite the controversy over his methods.
He was clearly becoming a significant, maybe feared figure within the movement. But then he suffered a major personal blow.
Yes, a profound loss. In November 1907, his wife Cato tragically died from typhus.
Oh, terrible.
It left Stalin devastated, apparently. He had to send their young son Yakov back to Tiflis to live with his in-laws. Stalin returned to Baku and reconnected with this criminal gang known as the Outfit.
The Outfit. Sounds like something out of a movie.
Right. They were involved in all sorts of illegal activities: extortion, protection rackets, money laundering, even kidnapping the children of wealthy aristocrats for ransom. And they used the money from this to fund Bolshevik operations.
Wow, the lines were really blurred.
Completely. In early 1908, he took a brief trip to Geneva, Switzerland, met with Lenin again, and also with the prominent Russian Marxist theorist Georgy Plekhanov. Though Plekhanov apparently had a very low opinion of Stalin. This whole period just underscores this murky crossover between revolutionary politics and outright criminal activity.
It seems like his revolutionary life was deeply tangled up with the criminal underworld at this point. All that illegal activity must have put him constantly at risk of getting caught.
It absolutely did. And sure enough, in March 1908, Stalin was arrested in Baku, thrown into Belov prison. But even behind bars, he couldn't stop organizing. He became a leader among the imprisoned Bolsheviks, set up discussion groups, apparently even ordered the killing of suspected informants within the prison.
Ruthless even then.
He was eventually sentenced to 2 years of exile in Solvykhodsk, up in the Vologda province, northern Russia, arrived there in February 1909. But like his previous exiles, this one didn't quite stick.
He escaped again, didn't he? It seems like dodging the authorities was becoming his specialty.
Indeed, a recurring theme. In June 1909, he managed to escape from the village. He even disguised himself as a woman to get to Kotlis and then made his way to St. Petersburg.
Disguised as a woman? Seriously?
Apparently so. But his freedom didn't last long this time. He was rearrested in March 1910 and sent straight back to Solvykhodsk.
Back again.
Yep. During this second stint in exile, he had a relationship with his landlady, Maria Kuzakova. She gave birth to his second son, Konstantin.
Another child.
Yes. Then in June 1911, he got permission to move to Vologda for a couple of months. Had another affair there with a woman named Pelageya Onufrieva. He escaped again, got back to St. Petersburg, but was rearrested again in September 1911. This time, they extended his exile sentence for another 3 years in Vologda. This constant cycle, arrest, escape, rearrest, It really shows his sheer determination to stay active in the revolutionary movement, no matter the personal cost or risk.
It's a relentless cycle. Absolutely. Revolutionary work, arrest, exile, escape, repeat.
Hmm.
This constant defiance must have really boosted his standing among the Bolsheviks.
It certainly did. And a really significant moment came in January 1912. At the Prague Conference, the Bolsheviks formally broke away and established their own distinct party, separate from the Mensheviks, and they elected their first Central Committee.
Okay.
Lenin, along with Grigory Zinoviev, made a strategic decision. They decided to include Stalin on this crucial Central Committee. Stalin was still in exile in Vologda at the time,
Right.
but he accepted the position,
Yeah.
and he would hold a seat on the Central Committee in various forms for the rest of his life. Lenin saw Stalin as a Georgian, as someone who could be really useful in rallying support for the Bolsheviks among the many minority ethnic groups across the Russian Empire.
Ah, the nationality question again.
Exactly. So this appointment was a major step up for Stalin within the Bolshevik leadership.
So Lenin saw a clear strategic value in Stalin's background. And then, almost predictably at this point, he escapes exile yet again.
Precisely. In February 1912, Stalin orchestrates another escape, makes his way back to St. Petersburg, and there he takes on a really important job, transforming the Bolshevik weekly newspaper Zvezda the Star into a daily paper.
Which became?
Pravda, meaning truth. It was officially launched in April 1912. Stalin was the editor, but his role was kept secret.
Okay.
But this period of, increased influence, direct involvement, it was cut short again. Arrested in May 1912, this time a 3-year sentence of exile back in Siberia.
It's incredible how much of this crucial period he spent in exile, yet he managed to remain so central to Bolshevik activities. Where did they send him this time?
He arrived in this really remote village called Narym in July 1912. He actually shared lodgings there with another important Bolshevik, Yakov Sverdlov.
Yerdlov, right?
But just 2 months later, incredibly, Stalin and Sverdlov daringly escaped together and got back to St. Petersburg.
2 months. That's barely settling in.
I know. Then Stalin made a brief trip back to Tiflis, rejoined his old criminal gang for a bit, tried to rob a mail carriage, but that went wrong. Most of the gang got arrested. Stalin himself just narrowly avoided capture.
Risky business.
Very. He then went back to St. Petersburg and continued his work editing and writing for Pravda. It just highlights his continued reliance on both political networks and, well, these shadier connections too.
And his views on party unity, on working with the Mensheviks, seemed to shift again around this time, didn't they?
They did, yeah. After the October 1912 elections for the Duma, the Russian parliament, where 6 Bolsheviks and 6 Mensheviks got elected, Stalin actually wrote several articles calling for reconciliation between the two factions.
Really, after the split?
Yes. This initially caused some tension with Lenin, who was much more hardline against any compromise. But then, in late 1912, Stalin made 2 trips to Krakow, which was then in Austria-Hungary, specifically to meet with Lenin.
Okay.
And through those discussions, Stalin eventually came around to Lenin's view, aligning himself firmly against any compromise with the Mensheviks. Then, in January 1913, Stalin traveled to Vienna. The purpose was to address the really complex and tricky national question within the Russian Empire, the rights and status of all the different ethnic groups.
Right. Lenin saw him as key for that.
Exactly. Lenin encouraged him to write a major essay on the topic. The idea was to attract support from nationalities who wanted independence, hoping they'd eventually align with a future Bolshevik Russia.
And this essay became quite a significant early work for him, didn't it?
Absolutely. Stalin's essay, Marxism and the National Question, was published across 3 issues of the Bolshevik journal Prayzhenny in March, April, and May 1913. Lenin loved it, praised it highly. Historian Montefiore even calls it Stalin's most famous work. And he published it under the pseudonym K. Stalin.
Ah, the first appearance of Stalin.
Well, he'd been using variations since 1912, but this cemented it. Stalin, derived from the Russian word stal, meaning steel, so man of steel.
Right.
It's widely thought he was consciously emulating Lenin, who also used pseudonyms, and Stalin became his public identity for the rest of his life. The essay itself laid out a key part of the Bolshevik theoretical approach to national minorities.
But his time focusing on theory was once again cut short by the authorities.
Yes, predictable pattern. In February 1913, Stalin was arrested yet again in St. Petersburg. This time, the sentence was harsher. 4 years of exile in the really remote Turkensk region of Siberia.
Durdokovsk. That sounds bleak.
It was notorious, extremely harsh conditions, very, very difficult to escape from. He arrived in a village called Monastirsko in August, but was moved after only 6 weeks to another place, Kostino.
Why move him?
They were worried he might try to escape, even from there. So in March 1914, the authorities moved him even further north to a tiny village called Kureka, right near the Arctic Circle.
The Arctic Circle.
Yeah.
Wow.
This final exile was in an exceptionally isolated, incredibly unforgiving environment, almost impossible to get away from.
Even in that extreme isolation, deep in Siberia, his personal life continued its complex course.
Indeed. While he was in Kureka, Stalin began a relationship with a local girl named Lydia Perepurgina. She was only 14 years old at the time.
14. He was in his mid-30s then.
Yes. According to Montefiore, they had a child together around December 1914, but tragically, the infant died shortly after birth.
Oh, dear.
Then later, they had another child, a son named Alexander, born around April 1917. In Kureka, Stalin lived among the indigenous Tungus and Ostyak peoples. Spent a lot of his time just fishing, trying to survive in that incredibly harsh climate. It's such a stark contrast, this remote, almost primitive existence, compared to his growing influence within the revolutionary movement far away.
So even in the brutal isolation of Siberian exile, his life is marked by these quite significant and troubling personal events. And then the world outside is completely transformed by the outbreak of World War I.
Exactly. While Stalin was stuck in Kureka, Russia entered World War I. In October 1916, Stalin, along with many other exiled Bolsheviks, was actually conscripted into the military. They were moved to Monastirsko.
Okay.
They stopped in Krasnoyarsk in February 1917. And it was there that Stalin was formally exempted from military duty because of his disabled arm.
The old injury.
Right. Rather than face more prison time, he asked for permission to complete his alternative service, you could say, in Achinsk, which was a town closer to the Trans-Siberian Railway.
And it was there, in Achinsk, that news arrived of the February Revolution, a truly world-changing event back in the capital.
Precisely. The February Revolution erupted while Stalin was in Achinsk. You have these massive popular uprisings in Petrograd, St. Petersburg's new name, which forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. Centuries of Romanov rule ended just like that, and a provisional government was set up. Right. Amidst all this revolutionary chaos and excitement, Stalin immediately headed back, took a train to Petrograd, arrived in March. There, he teamed up with another leading Bolshevik, Lev Kamenev. They quickly took back control of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda.
Pravda again?
Yes, and Stalin was appointed as the Bolshevik representative to the really powerful Petrograd Soviet Executive Committee that was the Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, a major power center.
So he's right back in the thick of it.
Absolutely. And it showed his standing within the party. In April 1917, when they held elections for the Bolshevik Central Committee Executive Committee, Stalin got the third highest number of votes. Lenin got the most, Zinoviev second, then Stalin.
Third highest. That's significant.
Very. It really underscores how, despite years in exile, his political skill and the respect he commanded within the revolutionary movement had put him in a prime position just as everything was about to change forever.
So by the time the February Revolution hits, Stalin has climbed back up to a position of real influence within the Bolshevik leadership. He's ready to play a major part in the incredible drama that's about to unfold.
Absolutely. He was perfectly positioned, really, to step onto the main stage as Russia underwent this radical, violent transformation. Okay, so let's dig into his role in Lenin's government now. After resigning from editing Pravda, Stalin gets appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities Affairs.
Right, dealing with all the different ethnic groups.
Exactly. And he hired Nadezhda Aliluyeva as his private secretary. She, of course, would later become his second wife.
Okay.
A really significant move came in November 1917 under Stalin's watch, the Decree on Nationalities. This was pretty groundbreaking, at least on paper. It proclaimed the right to secede, the right to self-determination for all the minority ethnic groups within the old Russian Empire.
That sounds incredibly progressive, especially for the time.
Yeah.
But was there perhaps a political calculation behind it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the Bolsheviks mainly saw this as a strategic ploy. They needed to win the support, or at least the neutrality, of these numerous minority groups scattered across the vast territory. They were hoping, of course, that these groups wouldn't actually choose to leave and pursue full independence once the Bolsheviks were firmly in power.
Right. A calculated risk.
That same month, Stalin traveled to Helsinki, met with the Finnish Social Democratic Party, and in December, he formally accepted their demand for independence.
So Finland got out early.
Yes. His department also actively funded things like minority language printing presses in schools, trying to show goodwill. But, the socialist revolutionaries who were rivals to the Bolsheviks, they were very critical. They accused Stalin's whole approach to the negotiations on federation self-determination of just being a smokescreen.
A cover for what?
For what they saw as the Sovnarkom's, the Bolshevik government's underlying imperialist and autocratic ambitions, it really highlights that constant tension between revolutionary ideals and the hard realities of trying to govern this huge multi-ethnic state.
And amidst all this, World War I is still raging, forcing the new Bolshevik government to make a major strategic move,
Yeah.
right? Relocating the capital.
Yes, exactly. With the fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary still going on, Lenin's government decided Petrograd was too vulnerable, too close to the front lines. So in March 1918, they relocated the capital back to Moscow.
Back to Moscow.
Right, more central, more defensible. Stalin, along with Trotsky, Sverdlov, and Lenin, they all moved into the Kremlin, lived and worked there. It was a powerful symbol of the Bolsheviks taking over the historical heart of Russian power.
And Stalin supported Lenin's controversial push for peace with Germany.
He did. He backed Lenin's policy of seeking peace with the Central Powers, even though it meant giving up huge amounts of territory. Interestingly, unlike Lenin, who still clung to the hope of imminent proletarian revolution sweeping across Europe,
Right, World Revolution.
Stalin was more pragmatic, maybe cynical. He didn't think that was likely anytime soon. So for him, a negotiated peace, however painful the terms, was necessary for survival. Lenin eventually managed to persuade most of the Bolshevik leadership to accept this view, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918.
That treaty caused absolute uproar in Russia, didn't it? Deeply unpopular.
Oh, incredibly divisive. The sheer scale of the territorial losses ceded to Germany and its allies just ignited widespread outrage across Russia. It had immediate political consequences, too. The left socialist revolutionaries, who had been part of a fragile coalition government with the Bolsheviks, they withdrew in protest. It fractured the political landscape even further. And shortly after that, the RSDRP officially renamed itself the Russian Communist Party, marking a clear break from its social democratic origins.
So amidst all this intense political turmoil and the ongoing global war, Stalin is steadily cementing his place in the new Bolshevik government. But his role soon expands beyond just nationalities into the military sphere as the Civil War heats up.
It did. As the Russian Civil War really intensified, Stalin's responsibilities grew. In December 1918, he was sent to Perm to investigate a major defeat the Red Army had suffered against Admiral Kolchak's White forces.
Okay.
He returned to Moscow for a bit between January and March 1919, but then he was immediately redeployed to the critical Western Front near Petrograd, where the Whites were threatening the city. And he showed a really ruthless streak there. When soldiers from the Red Army's 3rd Regiment deserted, he ordered the summary execution of several of them, right there, on the spot, as a stark warning to others. In December, he was moved again, this time to the Southern Front. Just shows his growing importance in the Bolshevik military effort, moving between crucial fronts.
It sounds like he was demonstrating a particularly, decisive and quite unforgiving approach to prosecuting the Civil War.
That's a really key observation. During the Civil War, he definitely cultivated an image within the party's Central Committee. He presented himself as this figure of, decisiveness, unwavering determination, someone willing to take responsibility in the heat of battle.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Not at all. His time on the fronts was also marked by repeated instances of insubordination. He frequently threatened to resign if he felt slighted or if his orders were questioned. He even faced public criticism from Lenin himself at the 8th Party Congress.
Lenin criticized him. For what?
For using flawed military tactics that, Lenin argued, had led to unnecessary casualties. But despite these criticisms, his perceived effectiveness in certain key situations meant he was still valued. He was awarded the prestigious Order of the Red Banner in November 1919. So this period really reveals the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of his rise within the Bolshevik hierarchy. He was effective, ruthless, but also difficult and prone to challenging authority himself.
And as the Bolsheviks started to gain the upper hand in the brutal Civil War, their focus began to shift again, didn't it? Looking beyond Russia's borders towards their international revolutionary goals.
Exactly. By late 1919, the Bolsheviks had largely won the Civil War, at least in the core Russian territories. So the Sovnarkom, the government, turned its attention back to that ambitious goal, spreading proletarian revolution around the world. This led directly to the formal creation of the Communist International, in March 1919.
And Stalin was involved in that?
Oh, yes. He actively participated in the very first meeting of the Comintern. This was the organization designed to coordinate and support communist movements globally. Now, while Stalin's personal views on how soon European revolution would happen might have differed a bit from Lenin's more optimistic take, he definitely understood the profound vulnerability of having just one socialist state, Soviet Russia, surrounded by potentially hostile capitalist powers. Even before the Comintern was officially formed back in December 1918, Stalin had prepared a decree recognizing the independence of the Soviet republics that had briefly existed in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, framing their earlier overthrow during the Civil War as an injustice.
Interesting.
And then in February 1920, further showing his rising influence, he was appointed head of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate Rapkrin, a really powerful body meant to oversee the entire Soviet bureaucracy. And in the same month, he was sent down to the Caucasus Front again.
So he's juggling major roles, consolidating the state domestically, overseeing bureaucracy, involved in military affairs, and participating in the push for international revolution. But as the 1920s dawned, Lenin's health started to fail, didn't it? And that must have had huge implications for the future leadership.
Indeed. The Bolshevik government, feeling more secure domestically now, started actively looking to expand its influence into neighboring countries. In February 1921, Soviet Russia actually declared war on the Menshevik government ruling in Georgia, Stalin's own homeland.
Wow. Invading Georgia.
Yes. And in April 1921, Stalin personally ordered the Red Army to take control of Turkestan in Central Asia. As the People's Commissar for Nationalities, he continued, at least publicly, to advocate for the rights of different national and ethnic groups to express their own cultures. He proposed this idea of autonomous republics within a larger unified Soviet federation.
Trying to balance central control with ethnic diversity.
That was the idea, yes.
Yeah.
A way to manage the vast diversity of the former Russian Empire.
But this policy on nationalities, even though it seemed designed to foster unity, it apparently drew criticism from different ideological camps, didn't it?
It certainly did. On one side, you had some Marxist theorists who criticized Stalin. They saw his emphasis on national identity, even within a federation, as leaning towards bourgeois nationalism, contradicting the core internationalist principles of Marxism.
No.
But then, on the other side, you had people accusing him of having a pro-Russian bias. They suspected that these autonomous republics were just a clever way for Moscow to exert control over non-Russian territories, giving only the appearance of autonomy.
A tricky balancing act.
Extremely. And the Caucasus region, with its incredibly complex mix of ethnicities, languages, and histories, presented the biggest challenge to his policy. Stalin notably opposed creating fully separate autonomous republics for Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. He argued that Mian wouldn't actually prevent ethnic oppression between the groups.
So what did he propose instead?
He pushed hard for a single, unified, Transcaucasian Federal Soviet Socialist Republic, a much more centralized approach for the whole region.
And that caused conflict.
Huge conflict, especially with the Georgian Communist Party. It led to a major and quite bitter dispute known as the Georgian Affair.
And Stalin himself got directly involved in trying to sort this out.
Yes. In mid-1921, Stalin went back to his native South Caucasus. He personally met with the Georgian communists, urging them to abandon what he saw as their national chauvinism, telling them they needed to respect the rights and needs of the minority groups living alongside them, people like the Abkhazians, Ossetians, and Ajorians. During that same trip, Stalin also saw his son Yakov, who had been living with relatives. He decided to bring Yakov back with him to Moscow to raise him there, right at the center of Bolshevik power. And just a few months earlier, in March 1921, his second son, Vasily, had been born to his wife, Nadezhda. So a lot happening personally and politically for him around this time. It really highlights his direct, often quite heavy-handed involvement in shaping the actual structures of the Soviet state, even in these very early formative years.
It sounds like these were absolutely critical years for defining the very structure of the Soviet state, and clearly marked by major debates, serious disagreements, even right at the very top of the Bolshevik leadership. And within those crucial discussions, fundamental disagreements emerged, even between Lenin and Stalin themselves, over the future shape of the Union.
Absolutely. Lenin and Stalin had really quite different visions for what the final structure of the Soviet state should look like. Lenin initially advocated for something called a Union of Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia.
Wow. Ambitious title.
Right. He envisioned this future where Soviet influence would spread across both continents and Soviet Russia would just be one equal member alongside other sovereign Soviet republics.
Okay.
Stalin, however, was worried. He feared that giving too much autonomy, too much independence to the non-Russian nationalities would ultimately weaken Moscow's central control and could even lead to the whole thing fragmenting.
So he wanted tighter control.
Exactly. He preferred a model where the minority nationalities would join Soviet Russia as autonomous republics, essentially keeping them under much tighter central supervision. This led to a real clash. Lenin sharply criticized Stalin for what he called Great Russian chauvinism, accusing him of basically prioritizing Russian dominance.
And Stalin's response.
Stalin fired back, accusing Lenin of national liberalism, basically saying Lenin was being too soft, too permissive towards these national aspirations.
So a real ideological battle. How did they resolve it?
Well, eventually they reached a compromise. They agreed on the name, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Its creation was formally ratified in December 1922.
Got it.
But, and this is crucial, despite the name and the nominally federal structure, the real power, the key policy decisions, remained firmly in the hands of the Communist Party Politburo sitting in Moscow.
And their personal relationship also took a serious hit during Lenin's final years, didn't it? Stemming from Stalin's behavior.
Yes, it became increasingly strained, quite fractured, actually. Lenin was reportedly furious when he found out that Stalin had subjected his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, to some really harsh verbal abuse over the phone.
Oh, dear. Not good.
Not good at all. And in the last period where Lenin was still actively working, he dictated what became known as his testament. In this really significant document, which Krupskaya later shared with several senior Bolshevik leaders, Lenin was sharply critical of Stalin.
What did he say?
He criticized Stalin's perceived rudeness, his disloyalty, his growing authoritarian tendencies, and crucially, he recommended that Stalin should be removed from his powerful post as general secretary of the party. Lenin was clearly very concerned about Stalin's accumulating power.
Wow. Lenin wanted him removed.
That's what the testament says. However, it's worth noting, the historian Stephen Kotkin has raised some questions about the exact drafting and authenticity of the testament, suggesting Krupskaya herself might have had a significant hand in its composition. But, importantly, Stalin himself never publicly denied its existence or its contents. And that testament, regardless of the exact circumstances of its creation, became a hugely important factor in the intense power struggles that erupted immediately after Lenin's death.
So even as Lenin's health failed, the seeds of the future, brutal power struggles were being sown. And Lenin himself had expressed serious doubts about Stalin's character and his suitability for leadership. Let's turn now to that critical period right after Lenin's death and how Stalin so skillfully, or perhaps ruthlessly, managed to seize absolute power.
Lenin died in January 1924. Stalin immediately and very visibly stepped into the void. He took charge of all the funeral arrangements. This was a hugely significant political move.
Why was that so significant?
Well, it allowed him to position himself as Lenin's chief mourner, as his most devoted disciple, the natural successor. He was, of course, one of the main pallbearers at Lenin's funeral.
Right.
And then, against the strong wishes of Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, the Politburo, heavily influenced by Stalin at this point, made this momentous decision to embalm Lenin's body and preserve it permanently in a grand mausoleum right there in Red Square.
The mausoleum.
Still there today.
Exactly. And that act was absolutely instrumental in creating and perpetuating the powerful cult of personality around Lenin, which became a cornerstone of Soviet ideology and helped solidify the Bolsheviks' authority. In that same year, 1924, Petrograd was symbolically renamed Leningrad in Lenin's honor. And to further cement his image as Lenin's loyal follower and heir, Stalin delivered this series of 9 influential lectures at Sverdlov University. They were titled The Foundations of Leninism, later compiled and published as a book that was very widely distributed.
And what about the elephant in the room, Lenin's testament, with its damning criticisms of Stalin? That must have come up.
Oh, it absolutely did. It resurfaced during this critical succession period. At the 13th Party Congress in May 1924, the testament was formally read aloud, but only to a select group of provincial delegates, not the whole Congress.
Okay.
Stalin was apparently publicly embarrassed by the sharp criticisms, and he made this gesture, offering to resign from his crucial post as general secretary.
A calculated risk. Almost certainly. A calculated display of seeming humility. And it worked, in a way. The Politburo, perhaps still underestimating his ambition or maybe needing him for other reasons, ultimately decided to let him stay on as general secretary.
Wow. A huge miscalculation by his rivals, looking back.
Monumental. That decision proved absolutely critical.
That seems like such a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Keeping that position, General Secretary effectively gave him control over the entire party machine, didn't it?
Yep.
Allowed him to just strategically build his power base from within.
Precisely. As general secretary, Stalin gained almost complete control over appointing people to positions at every level, all throughout the party and the state bureaucracy.
Huge power.
Immense. This allowed him to systematically place his loyal allies, his own people, into key jobs, gradually pushing out or marginalizing anyone who might oppose him. Within the party itself, he strategically favored younger members, often people from working-class backgrounds, maybe with less formal education, over the older generation, the old Bolsheviks.
By that.
Well, the old Bolsheviks were mostly middle-class intellectuals, university-educated, and crucially, they had their own independent prestige and power bases from the revolutionary days. Stalin preferred people whose loyalty was primarily to him.
Right. Building his own network.
Exactly. And alongside cultivating these rising officials, he also actively nurtured close personal relationships with the heads of the secret police, the Cheka, and its successor, the GPU. People like Felix Dzerzhinsky, Genrikh Yagoda, Vyacheslav Menzinsky. These were powerful and dangerous allies to have. And on a personal note, in February 1926, his wife Nadezhda gave birth to their daughter Svetlana. So his family life is unfolding amidst this intense political maneuvering.
And as he's skillfully consolidating his grip on the party apparatus, he starts to see his main rivals within the leadership, especially Leon Trotsky, as major obstacles to his ultimate goal, doesn't he?
Absolutely. After Lenin died, Stalin clearly saw Trotsky as the biggest threat. Trotsky had immense prestige, key leader in the October Revolution, founder of the Red Army, a real rival for legitimacy.
Right, a genuine contender.
Definitely. In fact, even while Lenin was still ill, Stalin had already started putting together an anti-Trotsky faction. He strategically allied himself with other big names like Kamenev and Zinoviev.
Even though they might have distrusted Stalin, too.
Exactly. Zinoviev, for example, was apparently already uneasy about Stalin's growing power. But at that crucial 13th Party Congress, he supported Stalin, seeing him as a necessary counterweight to Trotsky's influence at that moment.
Shifting alliances.
Always.
No.
Trotsky and his supporters, the left opposition, they were arguing that the new economic policy, the NEP, which allowed some private enterprise, was making too many concessions to capitalism, betraying socialist principles. They actually labeled Stalin as right-wing for supporting the NEP pragmatically.
Okay.
So in response to this challenge from the left, Stalin cleverly started building his own solid bloc of supporters within the Central Committee, gradually working to isolate and marginalize the left opposition. He also managed to secure the crucial support of Nikolai Bukharin.
Bukharin, another major theorist.
Right. Bukharin also believed that the left opposition's radical proposals would just destabilize the Soviet Union and ruin its economic recovery. So he sided with Stalin against Trotsky.
So it was this incredibly complex strategic game, shifting alliances, calculated moves, playing factions off against each other.
Precisely. Textbook power politics. By late 1924, having used Zinoviev and Kamenev to help neutralize the immediate threat from Trotsky at the 13th Congress, Stalin then strategically turned on them.
Turned on his allies.
Yep, started systematically removing their supporters from key positions in the party, in the government bureaucracy, gradually chipping away at their power base. By 1925, Kamenev and Zinoviev finally realized what was happening and belatedly tried to fight back against Stalin and his new ally, Bukharin.
Too late.
Seems so. At the 14th Party Congress in December 1925, they launched this direct attack on Stalin's growing faction, but it failed. Stalin skillfully turned the tables, accusing them of disruptive factionalism, of trying to undermine party unity.
And this intense internal power struggle just kept escalating, didn't it? Eventually leading to new, maybe desperate alliances against Stalin.
It did. By mid-1926, Kamenev and Zinoviev, seeing they were both vulnerable of facing Stalin's power, they made this dramatic U-turn. They actually allied themselves with Trotsky's remaining supporters.
Wow. Former enemies united.
Exactly. They formed what became known as the United Opposition, specifically to challenge Stalin. But this new bloc found itself under immense pressure from Stalin and his apparatus. They feared being expelled from the party altogether. So the United Opposition was eventually forced to publicly dissolve in October 1926.
Forced to dissolve.
Yeah, and its main leaders were compelled under intense pressure to publicly recant their criticisms of Stalin, a humiliating climb down.
Hmm.
But even after that public submission, the factional debates kept simmering beneath the surface. Stalin himself even strategically threatened to resign a few times in late 1926 and again in December 1927, maybe to test loyalty or consolidate support. But the final blow came in October 1927. Zinoviev and Trotsky were formally expelled from the Central Committee, a decisive victory for Stalin. Trotsky was then exiled internally to Kazakhstan, and later in 1929 forcibly deported from the Soviet Union entirely. Gone.
Wow. Just removed completely.
Some of the other members of the United Opposition, the ones who fully capitulated, they were eventually allowed back into the party, given minor jobs, but only after publicly admitting their mistakes and pledging loyalty to Stalin.
So by then, Stalin is effectively the supreme leader.
Pretty much.
Oh.
The undisputed leader of the party. He further cemented his control by appointing his utterly loyal ally, Vyacheslav Molotov, as prime minister. Other key Stalinists holding immense power in the Politburo now included people like Klement Voroshilov, Lazar Kaganovich, and Sergei Ordzhonikidze,
His inner circle.
his core group. According to historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, at this specific point, maybe late 1927, early 1928, Stalin was the chief of an oligarchic gang, but not yet a dictator, meaning his power, while huge, still relied on the backing of this inner circle. He wasn't quite absolute, not yet.
And during this intense period, while he's consolidating personal power, Stalin also starts pushing his own distinct ideological line, right? Something that broke from earlier Bolshevik ideas.
Yes, that's really important. In 1926, he wrote this key theoretical essay on the problems of Leninism, and in it, he forcefully argued for the concept of socialism in one country.
Socialism in one country. What did that mean practically?
It meant arguing that it was possible to build socialism successfully within the Soviet Union alone, even without revolutions happening in other major capitalist countries. This was a profound shift.
How so?
Because the older Bolshevik view, strongly associated with Lenin and especially Trotsky, was internationalist. They believed socialism couldn't ultimately survive in just one country, isolated and surrounded by capitalism. World revolution was seen as essential.
Right.
So Stalin's socialism in one country wasn't just a new ideological framework for the USSR. It was also a powerful weapon he used to further discredit Trotsky, who remained the champion of world revolution. It positioned Stalin as the pragmatist, the realist, building socialism at home.
So, by the late 1920s, Stalin has effectively outmaneuvered all his major rivals. He's established himself as the dominant force, politically and ideologically. And this now sets the stage for the incredibly dramatic and often brutal transformations that are about to sweep across the Soviet Union the next decade under his now near-absolute rule. Let's get into those turbulent years now. Forced collectivization, rapid industrialization, and ultimately the horror of the Great Terror.
The late 1920s really ushered in this period of radical and often incredibly brutal reshaping of Soviet society, all under Stalin's tightening grip. In early 1928, he took this significant trip out to Novosibirsk in western Siberia.
Okay.
And there, he publicly and forcefully accused the local kulaks, the wealthier peasants, of deliberately hoarding grain, holding back supplies from the state. He didn't just accuse them, he ordered their immediate arrest and the confiscation of their harvests. That grain was then shipped straight back to Moscow in February.
Wow, direct action.
Very direct. And under his command, special teams were set up across western Siberia and the Urals, specifically for grain requisitioning, taking grain by force. This inevitably led to increasingly violent clashes with the peasantry.
I can imagine.
Stalin then upped the ante. He announced that not just the rich peasants, but even the middle peasants would be forced to surrender their harvests to the state. This really aggressive stance caused outrage even within the top levels of the party. Bukharin and several other Central Committee members were furious, especially because they hadn't even been consulted, let alone agreed to these drastic measures.
He was acting unilaterally.
Increasingly so. This really marked the beginning of this fundamental, violent restructuring of Soviet agriculture.
This feels like the start of a systematic, brutal campaign targeting a huge chunk of the rural population.
It absolutely was. In January 1930, the Politburo, now firmly under Stalin's thumb, formally approved the policy of the complete liquidation of the kulaks as a class.
Liquidation.
Yeah.
Chilling term.
It is. Anyone accused of being a kulak, along with their entire families, faced mass arrest, the seizure of all their property, and forced deportation to remote, often deadly concentration camps or settlements. Huge numbers died just during the brutal transportation process or from starvation and disease in the camps.
How many people were affected?
By July 1930 alone, this campaign of decolonization had already hit over 320,000 households across the Soviet Union. The historian Dmitry Volkogonov called it, chillingly, the first mass terror applied by Stalin in his own country, highlighting the scale of the violence against his own people.
And this brutal policy, decolonization, it was directly linked to the forced collectivization of agriculture, wasn't it? Two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely inseparable. In 1929, the Politburo, again driven by Stalin, launched the policy of widespread, often coercive collectivization. Private land ownership was basically abolished. Peasants were forced to give up their land, their livestock, their tools, and join these new collective farms called kolkhozy or state-owned farms,
Right.
sovkhozy. And Stalin explicitly banned anyone branded a kulak from even joining these collective farms, further persecuting and isolating them. Now, officially, collectivization was supposed to be voluntary.
But in reality,
Many peasants joined out of sheer terror, fearing they'd suffer the same fate as the kulaks if they resisted. Others were directly threatened, beaten, or forced into joining by zealous local party officials and activists. The pace was relentless. By 1932, about 62% of all peasant households were in collective farms. By 1936, that number jumped to around 90%, a massive, rapid transformation of rural life.
but this rapid, forced collectivization must have had catastrophic effects on farming itself and on the lives of the peasants.
It was devastating. You had widespread discontent, simmering resentment, and often outright resistance among the peasants who'd lost their land, their independence, their traditional way of life.
Understandable.
This led to a massive drop in agricultural productivity. Many peasants, in desperation or defiance, slaughtered their own livestock rather than hand them over to the collectives. The immediate result was a horrific, widespread famine that gripped the country.
The famine of the early 30s.
Yes. It forced the Politburo to issue frequent, often inadequate orders just to redistribute dwindling food supplies to the worst-hit starving regions. You also had armed revolts flaring up against both decolonization and collectivization in Ukraine, the North Caucasus, southern Russia, Central Asia. These uprisings peaked around March 1930.
Were they successful?
No, they were all brutally crushed by the Red Army and the State Security Forces, the OGPU. And then, in a really cynical move to manage the narrative and shift blame, Stalin published this widely circulated article.
What did it say?
It basically claimed collectivization was entirely voluntary, and then he severely criticized local party officials for any supposed excesses or mistakes in carrying it out, passing the buck.
What was the reaction inside the party leadership to these clearly destructive policies? Was there any opposition left?
Well, Nikolai Bukharin, who had once been a key ally of Stalin's.
Right, against Trotsky.
Exactly. He became deeply skeptical, very critical of these radical policies. He saw them as a dangerous return to the war communism policies of the Civil War era, and he privately predicted they would fail catastrophically.
But could he do anything?
By mid-1928, Bukharin had already lost too much political ground. He just didn't have enough support within the party, which was now dominated by Stalin loyalists, to mount any effective opposition. Stalin moved quickly. Bukharin was removed from his influential position in the Politburo in November 1929.
Silenced.
Effectively silenced. One of the last potential voices of significant dissent within the top leadership was gone. Around the same time, you also had the launch of the Stakhanovite movement.
Ah, yes, the superproductive workers.
Right. This big propaganda campaign promoting individual hero workers like Alexei Stakhanov, who supposedly smashed production quotas by huge margins. It was all aimed at driving up worker productivity in industry, part of Stalin's relentless push for rapid industrial growth, no matter the human cost.
So the early 1930s. Immense social and economic chaos, the violent destruction of the traditional peasantry, this relentless drive for industrialization. It really sets a grim stage for the even greater crises that were about to engulf the country. The horrific famine reaching its peak, and then the unimaginable terror of the Great Purge.
The early 30s were indeed just fraught with turmoil. You had this growing popular discontent with Stalin's government bubbling up everywhere, not just in the countryside anymore.
Spreading to the cities.
Yes. Civil unrest started spreading to urban areas, reflecting the widespread hardship and dislocation. Faced with this rising tide, Stalin actually made some cautious moves to slightly moderate his most extreme economic policies in 1932.
Like what?
Well, in May 1932, he allowed kolkhoz markets to open. Peasants could trade small amounts of surplus produce they'd managed to grow on their tiny private plots.
A small concession.
Tiny. And it was immediately counterbalanced by even harsher measures to enforce state control over grain. Following Stalin's personal intervention, this notorious decree came out in August 1932. It made even petty theft of grain from a collective farm punishable by death or at least 10 years in the camps. The law of spikelets, they called it.
Death for stealing grain. Incredible.
Draconian. Now, as the Soviet Union moved into its second five-year plan, there was, on paper at least, a slight shift in priorities. Output targets were set lower than the crazy goals of the first plan, and there was more official talk about improving living standards, better housing, more consumer goods.
But did it happen?
Well, like the first plan, the second five-year plan got repeatedly adjusted, and ultimately it was massively impacted by the international situation, specifically Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933. That led to a huge reallocation of resources towards military buildup, defense production took precedence over everything else.
And amidst these policy shifts and the ongoing economic hardship, the Soviet Union is hit by that catastrophic famine.
Yes. The major famine really gripped the country through 1932 and 1933. The death toll estimates vary, but generally fall between 5 and 7 million people.
5 to 7 million.
Just staggering.
Unimaginable. The worst affected areas were Ukraine and the North Caucasus. But it also hit Kazakhstan hard, and various Russian provinces too. This horrific event, known in Ukraine as the Holodomor, meaning death by starvation, it remains incredibly controversial.
Especially the question of whether it was deliberate.
Exactly. Was it deliberately engineered by Stalin's government? There's no single document, no smoking gun order from Stalin saying starve the peasants, but a whole confluence of factors created the catastrophe. You had genuinely poor harvests in 31 and 32 due to bad weather, yes, but the chaos of collectivization, the slaughter of livestock, the unrealistic centralized planning, government policies that prioritized grain exports for industrial machinery over feeding its own people.
They were still exporting grain during a famine. Yes. Exports dropped significantly, but they continued. The state also failed to build up any adequate grain reserves. Stalin himself publicly blamed the whole thing on wreckers and saboteurs among the peasantry.
Passing the blame again.
Always. Any government aid that was provided was very limited and disproportionately went to the cities, to the industrial workers, not the starving countryside. For Stalin, it seems clear, rapid industrialization was the absolute priority, even if it cost millions of peasant lives. And the famine itself. It was largely hidden from the outside world through strict censorship and propaganda. Stalin's government never admitted its role.
A truly horrific, devastating chapter. And while this immense tragedy is unfolding internally, the international scene is getting increasingly dangerous, isn't it, with the rise of fascism?
It was. The Soviet Union, trying to improve its vulnerable international position and counter these threats, made a big diplomatic shift. They joined the League of Nations in 1934.
Okay. Joining the international community.
Sort of. But at the same time, perhaps paradoxically, secret talks were happening between Stalin and Hitler, starting as early as October 1933. Stalin reportedly had a grudging admiration for how quickly Hitler consolidated power after the Night of the Long Knives purge.
Strange bedfellows.
Very. But despite that initial, maybe tactical contact, Stalin increasingly saw the long-term danger posed by fascism, its expansionism, its virulent anti-communism. So the USSR started actively looking for alliances with the Western democracies, primarily France and Britain.
Right. Collective security against Hitler.
That was the idea. In May 1935, they signed a mutual assistance treaty with both France and Czechoslovakia. And then, at the Seventh Comintern Congress in Moscow later that year, there was a major shift in international communist strategy.
What was that?
The Soviet Union basically told communist parties around the world to drop their previous sectarianism and instead form broad, popular fronts with other leftist, even liberal groups to fight fascism together.
A united front.
Exactly. And in direct response to this Soviet-led anti-fascist push, the anti-communist governments, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, they signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, solidifying their alliance against communism. The battle lines were being drawn. The Soviet Union also got heavily involved in the Spanish Civil War, sending aid and advisors to support the Republican side against Franco's nationalists, who were backed by Germany and Italy. It just shows the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of Soviet foreign policy under Stalin, trying to navigate this rapidly worsening global situation.
So a complex foreign policy, trying to build alliances against fascism, while also, initially at least, keeping lines open to Hitler. And then, amidst all this international tension, the internal repression within the Soviet Union reaches its absolute terrifying peak with the Great Purge, or Great Terror.
Yes. As the 1930s wore on, Stalin unleashed this brutal, systematic campaign of political repression, the Great Purge. It targeted huge numbers of people, former party members, including many of the original old Bolsheviks who'd made the revolution, even current members of the Central Committee. They were arrested en masse. The accusations were often wild, fabricated, conspiring with Western spies, sabotage, plotting assassinations. These charges inevitably led to imprisonment in the Gulag, internal exile, or execution.
And the infamous Moscow trials were part of this.
They were the public face of it, these elaborate show trials. The first big one was in August 1936. Famous old leaders like Kamenev and Zinoviev were convicted of treason after making these coerced, obviously false confessions, and then executed.
Horrifying.
The second trial followed in January 1937, the third in March 1938. In that last one, even figures like Bukharin and Rykov, who had been close allies of Stalin, were accused of being part of some fantastical Trotskyite Zinovievite terror plot. Convicted and executed.
It seems no one was safe.
No one. By the end of 1937, almost the entire original Bolshevik leadership had been eliminated, executed, imprisoned, exiled. The Politburo was now packed almost exclusively with Stalin's own loyalists, people who owed their careers entirely to him. And he didn't stop there. He actively pushed other communist parties around the world to conduct their own purges, to root out any non-Stalinist elements in their ranks. The Great Purge effectively wiped out any potential opposition, real or imagined, and cemented Stalin's absolute personal dictatorship over the party and the entire country.
The Great Purge. A period of just unimaginable terror, immense loss of life. It really solidified Stalin's position as the unquestioned dictator. As the 1930s ended, the world was teetering on the brink of World War II, and Stalin's actions, his strategic thinking in the lead-up to that devastating war, they remain subjects of intense debate and scrutiny even today.
Well, as a committed Marxist-Leninist, Stalin fundamentally believed that a major war between the big capitalist powers was basically inevitable. He saw it coming. And at the German annexation of Austria, then parts of Czechoslovakia in 1938, that just confirmed his belief that a large-scale European war was imminent.
So what was his strategy?
His main goal was to keep the Soviet Union neutral in that coming conflict, at least initially. He hoped that a long, bloody war between Germany on one side and Britain and France on the other would exhaust them both, weaken them enough so that the USSR could eventually emerge as the dominant power in Europe.
Playing the long game.
Exactly. Plus, the Soviets also faced a threat from the East. There were serious border clashes with Japan in the late 30s. So, facing potential threats on two fronts, Stalin ordered a massive expansion of the Red Army between early 1939 and mid-1941.
Building up the military.
Yes, but this rapid growth came at a cost. The quality of the officer corps, the training of the troops, it suffered. And compounding that problem, Stalin launched another devastating purge, this time within the military high command, between mid-1940 and 1941.
Purging the army right before a potential war seems risky.
Incredibly risky. It left the Red Army critically short of experienced senior commanders just months before the German invasion actually happened.
And despite his deep ideological hatred of Nazi Germany, its anti-communism, Stalin still made that pragmatic or perhaps cynical decision to actually enter into negotiations with Hitler's regime.
Yes, it was a stunning turnaround. Stalin personally met with the German foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop right there in the Kremlin in 1939. This signaled a dramatic shift.
Why did he do it?
Well, Britain and France seemed unwilling or unable to commit to a firm military alliance with the Soviet Union against Germany. They were dragging their feet, deeply suspicious of the Soviets. So Stalin began cautiously exploring an alternative, reaching some kind of understanding with Hitler. On May 3rd, 1939, he made a key personnel change. He replaced Maxim Litvinov, the long-serving foreign minister, who was seen as somewhat pro-Western and was Jewish, with his loyal right-hand man, Vyacheslav Molotov. The world saw that as a clear signal. The USSR was open to talking to Germany.
And Germany was receptive.
Very. Germany actively started negotiations proposing the secret deal to basically carve up Eastern Europe between them into defined spheres of influence. Stalin saw this as a golden opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
To expand Soviet territory westward, grab land lost after World War I, and crucially to buy time. To achieve a temporary, uneasy peace with Nazi Germany, giving the USSR more time to prepare for the inevitable future conflict he still believed was coming.
And this led directly to the signing of that infamous agreement, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. What were the immediate results of that pact?
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this non-aggression treaty, was signed in Moscow in August 1939. It had secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe. Just 1 week later, Germany invaded Poland from the west.
Triggering World War II.
Exactly. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Then, on September 17th, with the Polish army collapsing under the German blitzkrieg, the Red Army invaded eastern Poland from the other side. They claimed they were just restoring order, protecting the local Belarusian and Ukrainian populations.
Right.
On September 28th, Germany and the Soviet Union finalized the deal, exchanging some bits of conquered Polish territory. Germany got areas with more Polish speakers. The USSR got Lithuania added to its sphere. They signed the German-Soviet Frontier Treaty shortly after. Stalin himself was there for the ceremony. And critically, the pact included economic agreements. The Soviet Union supplied Germany with vital raw materials, which helped undermine the British naval blockade of Germany. It had huge, devastating consequences, especially for Poland and the Baltic states.
And the Soviet Union's territorial ambitions didn't stop there, did they, with Poland and the Baltics?
No, they certainly didn't. The Soviets then turned their attention to Finland, issued demands for territorial concessions, which the Finns flatly refused.
So what happened?
The Soviet Union invaded Finland in November 1939. That started the Winter War. Despite having vastly more troops and tanks, the Red Army ran into incredibly fierce, effective resistance from the Finns.
The Finns fought hard.
They did. International opinion largely sided with Finland, and the Soviet Union was actually expelled from the League of Nations over the invasion. The war eventually ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940. Finland was forced to give up some key territory.
And then the Baltic states.
Yes. In June 1940, while Germany was busy conquering France, the Red Army simply marched into and occupied Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were formally annexed into the USSR in August 1940.
That's like that.
And at the same time, the Red Army also invaded and annexed Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania. So a significant expansion of Soviet territory all across Eastern Europe in this period.
So the Soviet Union is actively grabbing territory in Eastern Europe right before the war really explodes across the whole continent. And this expansion, it was often accompanied by pretty brutal repression in those newly occupied areas, wasn't it?
Indeed. The Soviets moved very quickly to crush any resistance in these new territories, used brutal campaigns of persecution, arrests, deportations. A particularly horrific example is the Katyn massacre.
Katyn. What happened there?
In April and May 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, systematically executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police officers, intellectuals, prisoners of war captured during the 1939 invasion, murdered them in the Katyn forest and other locations. A terrible war crime.
Just awful.
Now, Stalin himself was reportedly quite surprised by how quickly Germany defeated France in the summer of 1940. That stunning victory maybe made him even more cautious. He pursued this policy of appeasement towards Hitler, trying desperately to postpone any direct conflict.
Appeasement? How?
Well, after Germany, Japan, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact in October 1940, forming the Axis alliance, Stalin actually bizarrely suggested the Soviet Union should consider joining them too.
Seriously, joining the Axis.
It seems incredible, but
Yeah.
yes, that proposal went nowhere, thankfully. But as another gesture towards Germany, the Soviets signed a neutrality pact with Japan in April 1941, despite their own ongoing tensions in the Far East. And then despite having been the de facto ruler for over a decade, Stalin decided he needed to formally take charge. He concluded relations with Germany had deteriorated so badly, he needed to assume the top government post himself. So on May 6, 1941, just weeks before the invasion, he replaced Molotov and became prime minister or chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, the official title.
Concentrating power right at the top.
Exactly. Perhaps signaling a new seriousness or maybe just consolidating his own authority right on the eve of disaster.
Despite all the evidence, all the warnings from multiple intelligence sources, the massive German invasion in June 1941 still caught Stalin and the Soviet leadership largely off guard, didn't it?
Yes, it's almost unbelievable, but true. Stalin stubbornly ignored a constant stream of warnings from his own spies, from the British government, even from German defectors, all pointing to an imminent invasion.
Why did he ignore them?
He seemed convinced it was all British disinformation, a plot to trick him into war with Germany. Even when he received detailed information, including the likely date of the attack, he dismissed it.
Tragic miscalculation.
Catastrophic. Even when the invasion actually began, in the early hours of June 22nd, 1941, Stalin initially hesitated. He seemed paralyzed, unwilling to believe it was really happening. It was Molotov, not Stalin, who made the first radio announcement to the stunned Soviet people.
Stalin was silent.
Initially, yes. Reports suggest he went through a period of profound shock, withdrawal, uncertainty in those first few days. He seemed overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. And crucially, he ignored the urgent advice of his top generals, like Georgy Zhukov.
What did they advise?
They wanted strategic retreats, establishing strong defensive lines, but Stalin initially clung to unrealistic, ultimately disastrous orders for immediate counterattacks. And then, in a desperate attempt to slow the Germans down, deny them resources, he issued his famous scorched earth policy in June 1941.
Burn everything.
Basically, yes. Destroy infrastructure, factories, food supplies in the path of the advancing Wehrmacht. And tragically, he also launched another brutal purge, this time within the military command itself. Senior officers were demoted, arrested, even executed for defeats or perceived failures.
Purging commanders during an invasion.
Madness. And then came the infamous Order Number 270. This decreed that any Red Army soldier who deserted or surrendered was a traitor. They could be shot on sight by their own side, and their families back home would be arrested and punished.
Ruthless.
Utterly. Throughout the war on the Eastern Front, it was just brutal beyond belief. Both sides, the Germans and the Soviets, frequently ignored the Geneva Conventions. The suffering for soldiers and civilians was immense.
It's an absolutely brutal, devastating conflict on that Eastern Front. How did Stalin manage to rally the Soviet people, mobilize the country's vast resources for this immense struggle against the Nazi invaders?
Well, the Soviet government, under Stalin, vehemently condemned the horrific Nazi atrocities, the massacres of communists, Jews, Roma people in the occupied territories. This genuinely fueled anti-Nazi hatred and resistance among the Soviet population.
Right.
Stalin also cleverly exploited the deep anti-fascist feelings among Jewish people, both inside the USSR and internationally. He authorized the creation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, JC, in April 1942.
What did the JEC do?
It became a really important channel for gaining international support, raising funds for the Soviet war effort, particularly from Jewish communities in the West. And crucially, of course, the Soviet Union formed that powerful alliance with Britain and the United States. The Lend-Lease program provided vital supplies, trucks, planes, food, raw materials.
Right, the Grand Alliance.
Domestically, Stalin oversaw this massive, largely successful effort to relocate industry. Factories were moved wholesale from the west to the central and eastern regions far from the German advance. This relocation, combined with an almost total focus on military production, led to incredibly high levels of output tanks, planes, guns, eventually surpassing even German production.
A remarkable feat of industrial mobilization.
Truly remarkable under the circumstances. And interestingly, during the war, Stalin showed a surprising degree of tolerance towards the Russian Orthodox Church, which had been heavily persecuted before.
Why the change?
Patriotism, unity. He allowed the church to resume some activities, even met with the Patriarch Sergius in September 1943. It was a symbolic gesture to rally the nation. He also changed the national anthem, replaced the Revolutionary Internationale with a new, more overtly patriotic song emphasizing Russian history and heroism.
Appealing to nationalism.
Definitely. And on the international communist front, he formally dissolved the Comintern in 1943. Told foreign communist parties to focus on national unity and fighting fascism within their own countries rather than immediate world revolution. Pragmatism again.
And militarily, after those initial catastrophic defeats, the tide eventually began to turn, didn't it?
Yeah.
With pivotal battles like Stalingrad marking a crucial turning point.
Yes. Although before Stalingrad, there were still setbacks. In April 1942, Stalin, perhaps still prone to overconfidence, ordered this big Red Army counteroffensive in eastern Ukraine, aimed at retaking Kharkiv. It failed badly.
Okay.
Then, in June 1942, the Germans launched their massive summer offensive, Operation Blau, heading towards the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad became a key symbolic and strategic objective. Stalin issued his famous order, hold the city at all costs, not a step back.
The battle for Stalingrad,
Yeah.
legendary.
Absolutely legendary for its brutality and significance, intense house-to-house urban warfare, immense casualties on both sides. But the Soviet victory in February 1943 achieved through a brilliant encirclement operation trapping the entire German Sixth Army. That was the major turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. It showed the resilience, the growing strength, the sheer determination of the Red Army.
Stalingrad was indeed a devastating blow to the Germans, a huge psychological and military victory for the Soviets. How did they manage to capitalize on that momentum and start pushing the Germans back across that vast front?
Well, even before the final surrender at Stalingrad, by November 1942, the Soviets were already launching effective counteroffensives. Operation Uranus, the Stalingrad encirclement, was key. Despite suffering horrific casualties themselves, maybe 2.5 million in those southern battles alone, the Red Army had undeniably grabbed the strategic initiative.
They had the momentum.
They did. The Germans tried one last massive offensive to regain the upper hand, around the Kursk salient in the summer of 1943. The biggest tank battle in history. But it ended in a decisive Soviet victory. That really sealed Germany's fate on the Eastern Front.
Kursk, another huge battle.
Massive. By the end of 1943, the Soviet Union had liberated roughly half the territory the Germans had occupied since 1941. A stunning turnaround. And a huge part of that was the incredible surge in Soviet military production.
The relocated factories paying off.
Absolutely. Stalin's decision early on to move those vital industries eastward, away from the bombing and the advance, proved critical. It ensured a continuous growing flood of tanks, planes, artillery to the front lines.
And Stalin's image in the West, in Britain and America, also changed quite dramatically during this shared struggle, didn't it?
Yes, it really did. There was this growing, largely positive perception of Stalin in the Western Allied countries. He was seen as this crucial, stoic ally holding back the Nazi tide. Well, the London Symphony Orchestra held a concert in 1941 just to celebrate Stalin's birthday. And in 1942, the influential Time magazine named him Man of the Year. Huge profile boost.
Uncle Joe.
Exactly. Though apparently Stalin himself was initially quite offended by that nickname, Uncle Joe. He thought it was disrespectful, maybe condescending.
Interesting. And the leaders met.
Yes. Churchill flew to Moscow twice, enduring difficult journeys, to meet Stalin in August 42 and October 44, coordinating strategy. Roosevelt also desperately wanted face-to-face meetings, but Stalin, in contrast, rarely left Moscow during the entire war, which really frustrated Roosevelt and Churchill, who had to travel huge distances to see him.
These wartime conferences between the big three, Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, they were absolutely vital, weren't they? Shaping the war effort and the post-war world.
Hugely important. Stalin finally met both Churchill and Roosevelt together for the first time in Tehran in November 1943. And the location? Stalin picked it personally, underscoring his preference for meeting on territory he controlled or felt secure in.
What did they agree on in Tehran?
A key agreement was on the need to dismember Germany after the war, to prevent it ever becoming aggressive again. Stalin also kept pushing, relentlessly, for the Western Allies to open that second front in France. He was impatient. They finally did it, of course, with D-Day in June 1944.
Right.
Stalin also made clear his demands for Poland. He wanted the Soviet Union to annex the eastern Polish territories it had taken back in 1939 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Churchill strongly opposed this, very worried about Poland's future independence.
And the Balkans?
Ah, the famous percentages agreement. During a meeting in Moscow in 1944, Churchill reluctantly agreed to Stalin's proposal. Basically, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia would fall into the Soviet sphere of influence after the war. Greece would be in the Western sphere, a very cynical, realpolitik carve-up of Eastern Europe.
As the war continued to turn decisively in the Soviet Union's favor, the Red Army wasn't just pushing the Germans out of Soviet territory, was it? They were reasserting Soviet control over previously annexed lands and advancing into new areas of Eastern Europe.
Exactly. By the summer of 1944, the Germans had been driven out of most of the USSR. The Red Army was ready for the big push west. Operation Bagration, launched in June 44, was massive. It utterly destroyed the German Army Group's center in Belarus.
Opening the road to Poland and Germany.
Precisely. The German-occupied Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were swiftly re-annexed by the USSR. The Soviet advance also continued down into the Caucasus and Crimea. And this is where another dark chapter unfolds.
What happened there?
Several entire minority ethnic groups living in these regions, the Kalmyks, the Chechens, the Ingush, Karachay, Balkars, the Crimean Tatars, they were collectively accused by Stalin's government of collaborating with the Nazis during the occupation.
Was it true?
There were certainly individual collaborators, as there were everywhere, but this was collective punishment on a massive scale. Stalin's government dissolved their autonomous republics and forcibly deported almost the entire populations of these groups
Deported.
to remote, harsh regions in Central Asia and Siberia. Between late 1943 and early 1944, estimates are over 1 million people were deported under horrific conditions. Huge numbers died during the journey or in exile. Ethnic cleansing, essentially.
The Yalta Conference in February 1945. Another crucial meeting of the Big Three, right? With the end of the war in Europe clearly in sight.
Yes, Yalta, February 45. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin meeting again. By this point, the power dynamic had shifted even more in Stalin's favor, with the Red Army advancing relentlessly. Roosevelt and Churchill basically had to concede to many of Stalin's demands.
Such as?
Germany would pay the USSR $20 billion in reparations, huge sum. And the southern half of Sakhalin Island, plus the Kuril Islands, would be transferred to the Soviet Union as a reward for agreeing to enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat.
And Poland again.
Poland was still a major sticking point. They reached this compromise on paper. A post-war Polish government would be formed through negotiations between the London-based government in exile and the Soviet-backed Communist Lublin Committee.
But Stalin had other plans.
Secretly, yes. He fully intended for Poland to be under firm Soviet control. His actions during the Warsaw Uprising in the summer of '44 really showed his hand. The Red Army deliberately halted its advance and offered very limited aid to the non-communist Polish Home Army fighting the Germans in Warsaw.
Why?
Because Stalin didn't want a successful non-communist uprising succeeding in Warsaw. It would have complicated his plans for a communist-dominated Poland. He also insisted that the Red Army absolutely had to be the force to capture Berlin. Partly for prestige, but mainly to ensure maximum Soviet control over German territory at the war's end. Churchill saw this coming, suspected Stalin's motives, and tried unsuccessfully to get the Americans to race the Soviets to Berlin.
And in the end, the Red Army did take Berlin, leading to Germany's final surrender in May 1945 after an incredibly long and destructive war.
That's right. April 1945, the Red Army fought its way into the ruins of Berlin. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally in May. Stalin had apparently wanted to capture Hitler alive. Yes. But since Hitler was dead, his charred remains were secretly taken back to Moscow. Partly for identification, but also to prevent his grave becoming some kind of shrine for neo-Nazis. As the Red Army advanced westward, they came across the Nazi death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, others, uncovering the full horror of the Holocaust for the world to see.
A grim discovery.
Incredibly grim. But there's also a darker side to the liberation. Exhausted, brutalized Soviet soldiers engaged in widespread looting and, tragically, mass rape of women, particularly in Eastern Germany, but also in other liberated areas.
Was anything done about it?
Stalin explicitly forbade disciplinary action against the offenders. When the Yugoslav communist leader Milovan Djilas complained to him about the rapes, Stalin reportedly just shrugged it off. It said something like, "How can you expect soldiers who've been through such horrors to react normally? What's so awful if a soldier has fun with a woman after such horrors?" A truly chilling response.
Absolutely chilling. Then came the final wartime conference, Potsdam.
Yes. Potsdam, July, August 1945. Stalin met his new counterparts, Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister, and Harry Truman, the new U.S. President after Roosevelt's death. At Potsdam, Stalin repeated his earlier promises to Churchill that he wouldn't Sovietize Eastern Europe. Promises that, of course, proved hollow very quickly.
What else was decided?
Reparations from Germany were a big issue again. Stalin demanded huge amounts without really considering what was needed for the basic survival of the German population. This worried Truman and Attlee, who feared Germany would just become a massive financial drain on the Western Allies. Stalin also pushed hard for this policy of trophy brigades, basically allowing the Soviets to seize German industrial equipment, resources, anything of value from the occupied zones almost without limit. This was approved, but with some restrictions. And of course, they formalized the division of Germany into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British, French. And Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors, setting the stage for future Cold War confrontations.
With the end of World War II, Stalin really stood at the absolute peak of his power and global influence. But the post-war era brought entirely new challenges, didn't it? Especially the rapid breakdown of the wartime alliance and the descent into the Cold War.
Absolutely. With the war over, Stalin had reached what historian Robert Service called the zenith of his career. Inside the Soviet Union, he was seen by most people as the architect of victory, the embodiment of patriotism. His Red Army controlled all of Central and Eastern Europe, right up to the Elbe River in Germany.
A vast empire.
Effectively, yes. In June 1945, he even took on this new ultimate military title, Generalissimus of the Soviet Union, highest possible rank. He watched the Grand Victory Parade in Moscow's Red Square from atop the Lenin Mausoleum with Marshal Zhukov leading the troops. And at a banquet for his military commanders soon after, Stalin gave this toast where he specifically praised the Russian people as the outstanding nation, the leading force of the Soviet Union. It was the first time he'd really singled out ethnic Russians like that, rather than the broader Soviet people. A subtle but significant shift, maybe hinting at a growing Russian nationalism in his later years. But despite the USSR's massively strengthened position internationally, Stalin remained incredibly cautious, deeply suspicious of any hint of dissent or independent thought among his own population.
But even in that moment of apparent total triumph, his underlying suspicion, his authoritarian nature, continued to drive his policies in the post-war years, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Despite the USSR's much stronger global position, Stalin remained hyper-vigilant, paranoid even, about any potential disobedience. He was particularly worried about the millions of Soviet soldiers returning home from the war,
Why them?
especially those who had seen life in Germany and other parts of Europe, seen higher living standards, more consumer goods. Some brought things back. Stalin drew these dark parallels to the Decembrist Revolt back in 1825. Soldiers returning from Europe with dangerous ideas. He feared they might challenge the system.
So what did he do?
His paranoia led to the forced repatriation of Soviet prisoners of war, many of whom had survived horrific conditions in German camps. They weren't welcomed as heroes. They were forced through these so-called filtration camps, interrogated intensely about their loyalty.
And there was
Around 2.8 million soldiers went through this filtration, and tragically, about half of them were then arrested and sent straight to the Gulag labor camps, punished for surviving.
unbelievable.
And the repression continued elsewhere. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which had fiercely resisted being reabsorbed into the USSR, Stalin launched renewed campaigns of dekolonization, targeting farmers and eliminating clergy. Another wave of deportations. Around 142,000 people deported from the Baltics between 1945 and 1949.
The Gulag system expanded after the war.
Significantly. By January 1953, the scale was immense. About 3% of the entire Soviet population was either imprisoned or in forced exile. That's 2.8 million people in special settlements, basically internal exile in remote, harsh areas. And another 2.5 million in the camps themselves, exile colonies or prisons.
The human cost is just staggering. And the physical cost of the war.
Immense. NKVD assessments estimated 1,710 towns and 70,000 villages across the Soviet Union had been destroyed or severely damaged. And the human loss. NKVD estimates put Soviet civilian deaths during the war at 26 to 27 million, plus millions more wounded, malnourished, orphaned.
Almost impossible to comprehend that scale of devastation. And within the Soviet leadership itself, were there any discussions about changing course after the war? Any proposals for reform?
There were some cautious feelers. Some of Stalin's colleagues apparently proposed certain changes, maybe sensing a new mood or new needs in the post-war era. And Soviet society did become slightly more relaxed in some ways compared to the intense pressure cooker of the pre-war 1930s.
How so?
Well, Stalin allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to keep managing the churches that had reopened during the war. There was maybe a little more breathing room for academics and artists compared to the absolute control before 1941. The government also recognized the need to tackle the massive post-war inflation and rebuild the shattered economy. So in December 1947, they carried out a major currency reform, devaluing the ruble and abolished the wartime food rationing system. That was generally popular.
Any other signs of relaxation?
Interestingly, they abolished the death penalty in 1947.
Really? Abolished it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was reintroduced just 3 years later in 1950. So any liberalization was clearly limited and reversible.
And on the world stage, that wartime alliance with the West just completely evaporated, didn't it? Plunging into the Cold War.
It dissolved incredibly quickly. Tensions between the former allies escalated rapidly, ushering in the Cold War era, ideological conflict, proxy wars, the nuclear arms race. Now, although Stalin publicly accused Britain and the U.S. of being aggressive, of plotting against the USSR, privately, his assessment seems to have been that a direct war with them wasn't likely in the near future. He apparently anticipated decades of this tense, competitive coexistence. But despite that assessment, he secretly poured huge resources into the Soviet atomic bomb project. He understood the strategic necessity of matching the U.S. nuclear capability.
As Stalin entered his final years, his health was failing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And his paranoia, always present, seemed to intensify, leading to some really erratic and disturbing actions.
Yes, his health definitely declined in his last years. He started spending much more time away from Moscow at his various dachas, went to Abkhazia on the Black Sea for 5 months in both 1950 and 1951.
Long absences.
Very long. And his deep-seated distrust seemed to grow. He became suspicious even of his own doctors. In January 1952, he actually ordered the arrest of one of his physicians simply because the doctor had advised him to slow down, step back a bit for health reasons.
Arrested for giving medical advice.
Unbelievable, isn't it? Then, in September 1952, came the infamous doctor's plot. Numerous Kremlin doctors, most of them Jewish, were arrested. The fabricated charge: plotting to assassinate top Soviet leaders through medical means.
Pure paranoia, with clear anti-Semitic overtones.
Absolutely. This coincided with the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia in November '52. 13 high-ranking communist officials, 11 of them Jewish, were convicted on absurd charges of being part of an American Zionist plot. And there was a similar trial of Jewish saboteur workers in Ukraine around the same time, a definite late surge of anti-Semitism.
And purges continued elsewhere, too.
Oh, yes. In 1951, Stalin launched the Mingrelian Affair in his native Georgia, another brutal purge targeting supposed nationalist elements within the Georgian Communist Party. Over 11,000 people were expelled or repressed.
He never stopped purging.
It seems not. From 1946 until his death, he also became much more withdrawn publicly, gave only 3 speeches, 2 of them just a few minutes long. His writing output dropped dramatically, too, though in 1950 he published Marxism and Problems of Linguistics.
Linguistic. Why?
It seemed to reflect his growing preoccupation with the status of the Russian language and the Russian people within the multi-ethnic Soviet state. His final book, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, came out in 1952.
And his last major public appearance.
At the 19th Party Congress in October 1952, he gave this long, rambling speech to a Central Committee plenum, talked about the qualities needed in future leaders, but also pointedly criticized potential successors, especially Molotov and Mikoyan, highlighting their supposed shortcomings.
Undermining potential heirs.
Classic Stalin tactic. And in 1952, he made another structural change. Abolished the Politburo, the traditional center of power, and replaced it with a much larger, more unwieldy body called the Presidium. Maybe another way to dilute potential opposition or concentrate power further in his own hands.
And then, just a few months after that Congress, in March 1953, Joseph Stalin's incredibly long, incredibly impactful, and deeply, deeply controversial life finally came to an end.
Joseph Stalin died on March 5th, 1953.
Throughout his entire career, Stalin always presented himself as this dedicated, orthodox Marxist. What were the actual core ideas of his political ideology? Was he truly a devoted Marxist?
Well, he consistently claimed he'd understood Marxism by the time he was 15, and presented it as his lifelong guide. Stephen Kotkin described him as having a fervent Marxist conviction. Simon Sebag Montefiore even suggested Marxism played a sort of semi-religious role for him.
But how did his background fit in? He wasn't Russian.
Right. He never openly embraced Georgian nationalism, but his early Marxist views definitely had some nationalist undertones. Probably influenced by the Georgian cultural context, he grew up in folk uprisings, strong local traditions. A key thing about his ideology was his belief in adapting Marxism to reality. Pragmatism.
Creative Marxism, he called it.
Exactly. He said in 1917, there is a dogmatic Marxism and a creative Marxism. I stand by the latter. Basically justifying his flexible, often self-serving interpretations. Dmitry Volkogonov argued his specific brand of Marxism was heavily shaped by a kind of dogmatic spiritual turn rooted in his seminary education. Dogmatic, but flexible when needed.
So was it genuine belief or political convenience?
That's the debate. Robert Service assessed Stalin's new ideological initiatives as often being quite crude, vague developments of Marxism. Service argued they were often driven more by immediate political needs, justifying his actions after the fact rather than deep intellectual commitment. He frequently used ideology post hoc. Stalin himself liked to identify as a practical revolutionary, focused on action over abstract theory.
A man of action, not words, in his own view.
That was the image he cultivated, prioritizing results, however achieved, over strict adherence to theoretical purity.
Beyond the politics and ideology, what about the man himself? His personal life, his appearance, his personality, he still seems quite enigmatic, despite everything written about him.
Well, ethnically, he was Georgian. Georgian was his first language. He only learned Russian properly around age 8 or 9, and he always kept a noticeable Georgian accent.
Did he identify as Georgian?
He was proud of his Georgian heritage, yes. But after 1917, he very much embraced Russian culture as a sign of loyalty and Soviet identity through citizenship and ideology. Montefiore called him a person of 4 ethnicities: Georgian by birth, Russian by culture, Soviet by citizenship, and internationalist by ideology. But Montefiore also noted that despite embracing Russian culture, his personality, his daily life kept strong Georgian elements. Some colleagues even described an Asiatic quality about him.
And physically. We know about the smallpox scars, the arm injury.
Right, the scars were often airbrushed from official photos. He was about 5 foot 7 inches tall, 1.70 meter, born with webbed toes on his left foot syndactyly, and that left arm was shorter, less mobile, due to that childhood carriage accident.
How did he dress?
In his youth, often quite sloppily, apparently, didn't fit the middle-class image. By 1907, he grew long hair, a big mustache, often wore traditional Georgian clothes like the choka, or maybe a red satin shirt, gray cloak, wide-brimmed hat. Very distinctive. But from mid-1918 onwards, he adopted that more familiar military style. Black boots, simple tunic, often carried a gun.
And habits.
Avid smoker. Pipes mostly, sometimes cigars. Publicly, he cultivated this image of living simply, being restrained, owning nothing luxurious. But his real focus, perhaps his only driving concern, was accumulating and holding on to power.
What can we say about his daily routine, his personal habits, how he related to people close to him?
His routine was quite unusual. Woke late, around 11 a.m., lunch mid-afternoon, 3 to 5 p.m., dinner never before 9 p.m., worked very late into the night.
Night owl.
Definitely. He often had dinners with Politburo members and their families at his dacha or apartment, mixing politics and socializing. But he rarely left Moscow, except for those dacha retreats. Hated traveling, refused to fly.
And his intellect.
Yeah.
Trotsky and others painted him as mediocre.
Yes, that image of the gray blur, mediocre, untalented, was pushed by Trotsky in the opposition, and it spread. But biographers like Montefiore, looking at accounts from both friends and enemies, argue Stalin was clearly extraordinary from a young age. Complex mind, great self-control, fantastic memory.
The hard worker.
Tireless, with a real thirst for knowledge, constantly reading. Once in power, he got involved in everything, micromanaging details from film scripts to architectural plans to tank designs. Volkogonov said his private and public life were one. He never switched off from politics.
What about friendships?
He valued friendships, but strategically, used them to build and protect his power. He was drawn to people like himself, maybe ambitious intellectuals from humble backgrounds, gave nicknames to favorites, could be approachable, enjoyed jokes, but often used humor as a weapon, too. His friendships were apparently volatile, affection, admiration, but also deep, bitter envy. Interestingly, he kept in touch with old friends in Georgia, sent letters, money.
His relationships with women and his family life seemed particularly complex, even tragic at times.
Some accounts say he wasn't really a womanizer. His former secretary Bozanov claimed women weren't a big focus. His wife Nadezhda was more than enough, though he paid her little attention. But Montefiore suggests that in his youth he seldom lacked a girlfriend, described his type as young, malleable girls or buxom peasant women, basically, sympathetic and not too demanding. Service's view was harsher. Stalin saw women mainly as means for sexual gratification and domestic convenience.
He was married twice.
Yes. First to Ekaterina Kedosvanidze in 1906. Montefiore calls it genuine love. Volkogonov thought she might be the only woman he truly loved. When she died young from typhus, Stalin supposedly said, "This creature softened my heart of stone." They had one son, Yakov. Yakov later had a daughter, Galina, but was captured by the Germans in WWII and died in a camp.
And the other children, the illegitimate ones.
Right. In 1914, in exile, he had that relationship with the 14-year-old Lydia Perepagina. They had a child who died in infancy. Then another son, Alexander, born in 1917. Stalin later found out about Alexander, but showed little interest.
And his second wife.
Nadezhda Alexeyeva. Their relationship was reportedly very difficult, full of quarrels. They had two biological children, Vasily and Svetlana, and they adopted a son, Artyom Sergeyev, in 1921. Nadezhda was apparently deeply unhappy, resented Stalin's behavior, believed him unfaithful. She committed suicide in 1932, a huge personal tragedy for Stalin, though he rarely showed it.
How was he with his children?
He often criticized Vasily for being undisciplined, though Vasily still rose rapidly in the Red Army due to his name. In contrast, Stalin was apparently very fond of his daughter Svetlana when she was young, and also had affection for Artyom. But later, he disapproved of Svetlana's husbands, straining their relationship. After WWII, he spent very little time with his children. Family wasn't a priority. Svetlana, of course, later defected to the U.S.
Any other relationships?
After Nadezhda's death, he became close to her sister-in-law, Xenia Alexeyeva. Montefiore believes they were lovers. There were also persistent rumors from 1934 about a relationship with his housekeeper, Valentina Istomina. And Montefiore asserts Stalin had at least two other illegitimate children he never acknowledged. Konstantin Kuzakov, who became a philosophy teacher but never met Stalin, and Alexander, Lydia Perepigina's son, raised by a fisherman, pressured by authorities not to reveal his father.
Stalin's personal life seems just as full of contradictions, complexities, and hidden aspects as his political rule. Turning now to his legacy, it's impossible to overstate his impact, but he remains one of the most fiercely debated figures of the 20th century.
Absolutely. The historian Robert Conquest famously said Stalin probably shaped the course of the 20th century more than any other single person. Biographers like Service and Volkogonov, even while detailing his crimes, acknowledge him as a truly remarkable, extraordinary statesman. Montefiore saw him as this rare, terrifying mix, an intellectual and a murderer, a consummate politician, and an inscrutable, fascinating colossus.
Interpretations vary wildly, don't they?
Hugely. As historian Kevin McDermott put it, they range from fulsome sycophancy to vitriolic denunciation. In the West, and among anti-communist Russians, he's overwhelmingly seen negatively. Mass murderer, tyrant. But for many other Russians, and Georgians too, he's still viewed as a great statesman, a nation builder.
What are the arguments for his positive legacy, such as it is?
Well, Service argued Stalin did build and stabilize the Soviet Union, suggesting it might have collapsed much earlier without him. He undeniably oversaw the transformation of the USSR into a major industrial and military power in just 3 decades. Huge advances in urbanization, military might, education levels, and Soviet national pride occurred under his rule. Life expectancy increased, infant mortality dropped, improvements in living conditions, nutrition, healthcare were real, even amidst the terror.
But that comes with a huge caveat, right? The cost. And was his economic contribution actually positive?
Exactly. That's hotly debated. Some researchers argue his policies from 1928 onwards, collectivization, central planning, actually hindered economic success in the long run, despite the rapid industrialization. And McDermott cautions against those oversimplified views of Stalin as this omnipotent tyrant controlling everything through sheer terror.
He wasn't all-powerful.
Well, his power was immense, obviously, but Service argues it wasn't absolute. He had to work within the Soviet structures he inherited. Kladen points out his power relied heavily on having majority support in the Politburo. Klevniuk notes that, especially later, when Stalin was weaker, there were periodic outbursts at the top, challenges to his authority. Stalin himself always denied being a dictator to foreign journalists, claiming they didn't understand the Soviet system.
And how has historical understanding evolved?
During his life, it was all officially approved hagiography, glorifying him, downplaying his non-Russian origins. After his death, and especially from the 1980s under Gorbachev's glasnost, archives started opening up. Stalin became this urgent topic for public debate in the USSR. After 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the remaining archives became accessible, leading to a flood of new information and much more nuanced scholarly studies.
And within the left, among communists and socialists.
Deeply divided. Some still see him as Lenin's rightful heir, the man who built socialism and defeated fascism. Others see him as a betrayer of Lenin's ideals, responsible for monstrous crimes that damaged socialism's appeal. Even the basic nature of the Soviet system under Stalin is debated. State socialism, state capitalism, bureaucratic collectivism, something entirely new. Volkogonov, himself a former Soviet general turned historian, admitted Stalin's actions badly damaged the great appeal of socialism born of the October Revolution.
And the most horrifying, most contested part of his legacy, the sheer number of deaths under his regime.
Yes. Stalin is undeniably one of history's most notorious figures because of the staggering mortality under his rule. Deaths from collectivization, famine, terror campaigns, the Gulag, war, disease, neglect. It's a horrific list. Accurately estimating the total number is incredibly difficult. Deaths were often indirect, records incomplete or deliberately obscured, so historians still disagree on the precise figures.
What are the main categories and estimates?
Well, forced population transfers, the Ukrainian famine, these have led to accusations of genocide. Official Soviet archive figures released after 91 record about 800,000 documented executions between 1921 and 1953. About 680,000 of those were just in 1937-38, the peak of the Great Terror.
Just executions.
Yes. Modern scholarly estimates for the Great Terror deaths, including those who died in detention or soon after release, put the figure higher, maybe 950,000 to 1.2 million. Than the Gulag. Archives show about 1 million officially recorded deaths in the camps between 1934-53. But the scholarly consensus now is the true figure is likely 1.5 to 1.7 million deaths, out of around 18 million people who passed through the Gulag system between 1930 and 1953.
So millions just from terror in the camps. What about famine?
Historians Wheatcroft and Ellman attribute about 3 million deaths directly to executions and neglect of prisoners. For the famines of the early 30s, Wheatcroft and Davies estimate 5.5 to 6.5 million deaths. Stephen Rosefield suggests a higher figure, maybe 8.7 million. In 2011, Timothy Snyder summarized modern data, arguing Stalin's regime was responsible for around 9 million deaths total, with maybe 6 million deliberately killed through policy. He considered older, higher estimates of 20 million or more unreliable due to lack of archival access then, but whatever the exact number, the scale is immense.
And how has Stalin's legacy been treated within the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet countries since he died in 1953? Has there been a consistent view?
Not at all. It's been a real roller coaster. Immediately after his death in 53, there was a period of de-Stalinization. Malenkov, his brief successor, denounced the cult of personality. Criticism started appearing in Pravda.
Then came Khrushchev's secret speech.
Right. The watershed moment in 1956. Khrushchev's speech on the cult of personality and its consequences at the 20th Party Congress. He slammed Stalin's repression, the personality cult, repeated it even more strongly in 1962. That led to symbolic changes, too.
Like removing his body from the mausoleum.
Exactly. In October 1961, Stalin's body was removed from next to Lenin's and buried near the Kremlin wall. A simple bust was put up later. Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd. Lots of statues came down.
But that de-Stalinization didn't last.
No. It stalled and effectively ended when Leonid Brezhnev took power in 1964. Under Brezhnev, there was a partial rehabilitation of Stalin's image. Emphasis shifted back to his role as the victorious wartime leader, the industrializer. The terror was downplayed. There were even plans floated in 69 and 79 to fully restore his legacy, but they were shelved, probably due to fear of public backlash.
And then Gorbachev.
Gorbachev, with glasnost and perestroika, felt he had to denounce Stalin again to allow Soviet society to heal and move forward. After the USSR collapsed in 1991, Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first president, continued that denunciation, extending it to Lenin, too.
What about Putin's era?
Putin's approach has been more complex, maybe ambiguous. He doesn't excuse Stalin's crimes, but he strongly emphasizes celebrating Soviet achievements under him, especially the WWI victory. He opened the Wall of Grief Memorial in 2017, saying the terrible past can't be justified or erased, but he's also warned against excessive demonization of Stalin, seeing it as an attack on Russia itself.
And public opinion in Russia today.
It shifted significantly. There's been a growing rehabilitation of Stalin's image in recent years. Amid post-Soviet instability, many Russians seem to view him now as a symbol of order, strength, national pride. He's revered by nationalists nostalgic for Soviet power. Polls show his approval ratings rising dramatically since 2015. A 2021 poll had 70% expressing a positive view. Another poll ranked him as the most outstanding national figure of all times.
Wow. Ahead of Pushkin. Ahead of Peter the Great.
Ahead of everyone. And you see a lot of new books, films in Russia portraying him positively, often distorting history, blaming repression on local officials, portraying it as necessary.
What about other post-Soviet countries? Georgia.
Georgia, his birthplace, is the other place where he's still widely admired, though opinion is more mixed than in Russia. Many Georgians resent criticism of him as their most famous historical figure. A 2017 poll showed 57% felt he made a positive contribution. There are pockets elsewhere too, Armenia, for example, but in places like Ukraine, which suffered terribly under him, especially during the Holodomor, attitudes are much more negative, though still divided.
So Stalin's legacy isn't settled history at all. It's still alive, deeply contested, politically charged, especially in the lands he once ruled.
It is indeed. So, wrapping up this deep dive, it's just overwhelmingly clear that Stalin's legacy is one of these stark, almost impossible contradictions. You have the monumental achievements side, transforming Russia, defeating Nazism, and then the horrific suffering side, collectivization, famine, terror, the Gulag. They exist side by side.
Yeah. For me, some of the real aha moments were those glimpses of his early life, the poetry, the seminary dropout, then seeing the ruthless, methodical way he climbed the Bolshevik ranks, the sheer scale and brutality of the transformation he forced on the country, and just how contested, how alive his legacy remains today.
And hopefully, for you listening, this deep dive has given you a clearer, structured way into this incredibly vast and complex history. We tried to pull out the key events, the policies, the personality traits that shaped Stalin's extraordinary and, yes, deeply controversial life and his undeniable impact on the 20th century and our world today.
So thinking about all these contradictions, the builder and the destroyer, the ideologue and the pragmatist, what does Stalin's enduring, often fiercely debated presence in our memory actually tell us? Maybe about the nature of power itself, the allure of ideology, or perhaps just how difficult, how contested the judgments of history always are. It's definitely something to keep exploring, digging into the sources, considering all those different, often conflicting perspectives on Joseph Stalin.